Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking a whole lot about the Turbografx 16 and PC Engine. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, all that sort of stuff, my new travel channel, etc. I appreciate the support on all those things. Thank you very much. Now let's get on with it. So yes, specifically today we're talking about the Turbo Everdrive Pro from Krikzz. And a huge shout out here and full disclosure on this. This was given to me for free for the purposes of review by a great website called retrotowers.co.uk. The guy Dan who runs it, I actually met him in the UK. He just handed this to me. So huge shout out to him for that. I've done videos on his stuff in the past. Very reputable site, great guy. We've known each other for like 10 years at this point. It's ridiculous how much time flies. But anyway, so yeah, he hooked me up with this, and if you want to check it out, there will be a link in the description. Thank you very much to retrotowers.co.uk. So what's the deal with this? What's going on? So this is the Turbo Everdrive. Elevator pitch, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys know what the Everdrive concept is at this point, but if you don't, here it is. This is a card that we all dreamed of having when we were kids, that you essentially would put into any particular game system, whether this, in this particular case, the PC Engine or Turbografx 16, but there's other ones, of course, you know, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, whatever it is. You put the card into those systems, you put an SD card into it with all the games, and boom, there you go, you're playing all the games off of one card. And they're high quality ones, not like the cheap Chinese bootleg ones and all that sort of stuff. These are the legit thing. So Krikzz always does a great job with these, and I've been talking about them for years, so much so that I actually have the old model here. This is the old version of the Turbo Everdrive. I think I even did a video on this back in the day. In fact, I might have got this from retrotowers.co.uk as well. I don't really remember, but I think I did. So what's the deal? Why is this different? If this plays all the games, why do I need this? So here's the basic thing. Back in the day when Krikzz was making, it says, yeah, production date July 6th, 2012. So it's been over 10 years. And in that time, he's made some updates. Now, the thing is, if you're not super familiar with the Turbografx 16 or PC Engine, and I don't really blame you because there's a lot of people that are not, because if you live in North America or Europe, it really barely existed. Europe, it almost essentially didn't exist. Here, it just kind of barely did. I didn't really know anybody who had one, but it did exist. But in Japan, it was a totally different story. It was stupid popular there. It actually beat out the Sega Mega Drive by a substantial margin and almost, you know, debatably could have toppled the SNES. I mean, it was pretty successful, hence there's all these different iterations of it. Now, it was basically a 16-bit competitor to those systems, and it resulted in a lot of high-grade, high-quality games that are a lot of fun that you probably just never got to play because they were exclusive to this system. So yeah, it's a pretty cool, solid experience, as I've talked about in the past. But yeah, that's the elevator pitch. But nowadays, the games are ludicrously expensive to try and collect for, and honestly, something like this really helps out. The system itself featured a standard system called the Turbografx 16 or PC Engine, which is just that basic white one over there, and then the standard Turbografx 16, which is here, although this has the CD unit attached. And in that, it had this little card slot. Now, the card slot was for the games which were called Hue cards. That is the vast majority of how the games were released. However, because it was so successful in Japan in particular, they also made it like these funky additional games. One's called like the arcade games that used extra hardware that had to be built into the card in order to run properly. There was also, of course, the SuperGrafx, which is right here. This you can kind of think of as, if you think PS4 to PS4 Pro, it was like PC Engine and PC Engine Pro. Like, it has extra stuff under the hardware, it can do some extra things, and in this case they made additional games for it, 5 specifically that uniquely only work on this system. Before we get to that though, just because I'm not going to talk about the SuperGrafx again, it does not do anything with this. This will work on the system. What I mean is SuperGrafx games cannot be loaded on this and then work on a stock system. It doesn't work that way. So we'll get that out of the way right now. But yeah, the original one couldn't support the Pro games. It also couldn't support the CD games. And yeah, it just basically played the standard Hue card games. It also had a region locking issue, which is not the card's fault. The system, the Hue card slot is region locked. It knows if it's Japanese or it knows if it's an American system. So on the old card, Krikzz thought of that and he just straight up put like a little switch on the side that lets you toggle between the regions. The new card, is region free. It's smart enough to know which one it's going into. So that the biggest changes there is that not only is it region free, it also has additional hardware under the hood. It has an FPGA built into it, which is basically hardware emulation. It's hardware tricking hardware into thinking it's other hardware, as a gross oversimplification, but that's essentially what it is. So in this case, it includes the arcade hardware, meaning all the arcade, when I keep using that term, but that's what they actually call it. Like I have one of the games here, it straight up says like arcade on the side. It supports those. It also, and this is its biggest new update, I guess, is that it also supports the CD games. Meaning you can load the CD games onto this and then run them through the cartridge slot, which is pretty neat. Now, the card itself also features a few different things. It's a chunky boy. As I mentioned before, it is thicker than the old one. That's primarily for the FPGA hardware, is the arcade stuff and all that. It has a little USB micro port, which I believe is only for specific sort of other diagnostics and stuff. It's not something that anybody else, your standard user, is really going to ever need to use in most cases. It has the SD card slot, which, let's talk a little bit about that. You're going to put a micro SD card in there, and you're going to want to have it FAT32 firmware, formatted to FAT32. I'm personally using a 128 gigabyte card, and it seems to be working just fine. I do not know the limitations of that. I imagine it can go higher, but I'm not sure offhand. And then there's also the reset button right there. The reset button is kind of interesting because it's kind of unique. There is not really a standard reset button on the system itself. So what it does is if you just kind of click it once, it resets the whatever game you're playing back to the beginning of that game. If you hold it down, it will actually bring you back to the Everdrive menu, which is a very nice feature because it means you don't need to power cycle, and I like that. Going back to the SD card here for a second, I'm sorry, I kind of jumped ahead. With the SD card, like I said, you're going to want to format it and all that. When you put it in, when you put a card into the system and then turn this on, what it will do is it will kind of set up the card for you, and then from there you take it back to your computer and then you can drop in various files. You're going to need obviously games, which you're going to have to sail the high seas of the internet to get yourself, unless you have a substantial Turbografx or Turbo CD collection. I believe you can use this card to actually dump it in some manner, although I did not attempt to do that. At least that's what I've heard. So anyway, you can put the games on there. You'll also need to put in BIOS files, which you'll also have to go to the high seas of the internet for, and put that on there as well. The BIOS files are only necessary for the CD games. They're not required for the HuCard games. So the HuCard games are pretty standard. Like, honestly, I mean, I'll show you right here in this footage. So when you just kind of click on a game and you just tell it to go, that's pretty much all there is to it. There's really nothing else special about it. It runs just fine regardless of region or whatever it is. And then that's it. You're up and running. It's not even like, you know, I mean, it's technically emulation, but it's not software emulation. Therefore, it's going to run perfectly as it should. It's the CD stuff that gets a little more complicated. The CD stuff is kind of to be thought of almost like a bonus feature because it has certain limitations. Now, I'm no engineer or anything, but as I understand it, you know, obviously the CD system attached in the rear. In the rear of these systems, there's an expansion port. That expansion port is how the Turbografx was designed to communicate with the CD interface. And because of that, you cannot interrupt that process. Meaning if you complicate it too much, then it doesn't work quite right. So this is trying to replicate that through the front port, meaning it thinks that the rear connection essentially is being used through the front, which works, but it also means you can't have anything else connected to the back of the system. So if you have, for example, the Turbo Duo R, which I have right here in front of me, that's actually the one that's connected right now. If this is, or sorry, this is the PC Engine Duo Rx. There's so many versions of this thing. If this thing is connected, this one automatically will not function with the CD games because it's got the CD unit built in, so automatically it doesn't work. The same applies to the Duo, the normal Duo, or any of the ones that have the CD units physically connected, because it just sees it as a conflict of interest, because it's like, wait a minute, there's two different CD units, that can't be, one doesn't work. So you have to actually disconnect it and use just like a stock one. If you're using the HuCard games, you can use any version of the system. It doesn't matter. Other than the Pioneer Laser Active NEC pack. That one just doesn't physically fit. But other than that, it should work on like every iteration. The HuCard games, not a problem. The Arcade Pro games, in most cases, are not a problem. As I said, SuperGrafx games are just straight up not going to work. So the CD ones are where it gets kind of funky. The best situation is straight up just like a stock Turbografx 16 by itself, stock PC engines, and then you'll have the widest array of compatibility. But that creates another problem because you can't use the expansion port at all, not just for the CD units. The issue is the expansion port is also how you got additional better video out of it. The standard units all just, for the most part, have RF out, or in some cases, like the core graphics, have AV composite out. But NEC thought ahead, like on the back of the Turbografx 16, that's actually how they gave you composite out, was through there. In modern times, there are all sorts of rear adapters for the system that actually give you things like RGB out or even HDMI output. You can't use any of them. Because if you do, this thing will just be like, yo, there's something on the back of the system that creates a conflict. I can't do it. So you basically have to use the stock version of the system. Or like this Turbografx 16 specifically has been RGB modded. It uses the Sega Genesis Model 2 RGB port out of the side here. This one would work fine, but I would have to disconnect the CD unit in order to play the CD games. Very ironic, but that's necessary. Yeah, overall, I mean, it's got some additional features. It has cheat code functionality. It also has various audio options. It is worth noting, though, that because the CD games were not meant to run through the HuCard slot, and I believe the HuCard slot only supported mono audio, whereas the PC Engine CD games supported stereo audio, it's incapable of running the stereo audio through the cartridge slot. In other words, if you're playing a CD game with this device, it's not going to sound as good as it should have originally because it can't. It's a hardware limitation. I also noticed in some games that the audio doesn't necessarily sync up right with the audio with the CD games, but again, probably a hardware limitation. It wasn't really meant to run that way, which is unfortunate, but it's, again, so I look at it more like a bonus feature than anything else. Like, it's cool. It can run the CD games. The CD games will run fine for the most part. You'll be able to play them and try them out and all that sort of stuff, but it's not necessarily the ideal CD experience. It also has custom backgrounds. If you're interested in that, you can run that in the settings and then check all that sort of stuff out. It's a Krikzz device. It's well made. He did everything he can with it. He does firmware updates that'll make it a little better here and there. In fact, at the time I got it, that was the first thing I checked, was that when I got it and I checked it out, I booted it up, it had the old like 1.03 or whatever firmware update. He, at the time I make this, had just released like 1.04. So I went and I grabbed the file, which is super easy. You just download off his website, you throw it in the root directory of the card, you put the card in the system, run it, and then in there you'll just see the file populate, and then you can just go ahead and tell it to install, and then it takes a second, it refreshes, and then after a moment it has successfully installed, and then you can go ahead and check it and see that the new firmware is successfully installed on there, which typically includes like little bug fixes for individual games and things like that, potentially new features. It's hard to say what Krikzz is ultimately going to do. One actually strange update is kind of funny. So as I mentioned, I have one of the this is an actual like arcade game. This is one of the Fatal Fury games, I think. And this game is the arcade game. It required the special arcade Duo card back in the day, which means you would have to buy it and stick it in there. I don't have that card. I never did. So whenever I would try to run this game, you just get a little image of Terry Bogard sitting there crying, and it basically explains, like, you don't have the arcade hardware, there's nothing you can do. Well, this actually does have the arcade hardware in it, so you can actually use this card for that. So it's not like it doesn't have additional bonus features, just kind of hidden under the hood, which I think is pretty cool. So if you're also out there thinking, like, I've always wanted one of those arcade cards, because those things are really expensive, this actually performs that function. In order to get it to do it, though, you boot it up as the Everdrive you normally would. You go into it like a BIOS folder where you've put those BIOSes, like the one you're seeing right here. Then you just run it, and you would actually get to this exact screen you're seeing, and you tell it to run with the disk already sitting in there, and then boom, good to go. It'll start running the game, which is very nice. So yeah, overall, solid piece of technology, very cool. I appreciated a lot of the little quirks and the good things about it. It is unfortunate that it has certain limitations, but I think that's just the reality we live in. But I have to stress this again. If you're the guy out there who has like just the PC Engine, and you bought one of those like RGB, rear connection things, and that's how you're using it, and you're thinking, oh, cool, I'll get this and just play it on there. You can do that, but with the HuCard games only. It will not work with the CD games. You'll have to come up with an alternative to run, unless you take that device off the back and are willing to run it through RF or whatever. Just keep that in mind. A lot of people are going to want to say, like, how does it compare to the Terra Onion device? Pluses and minuses. You know, they both have their positives and they both have their negatives. And overall, I don't know. I think they're both really solid devices. I think I like that this one is more compatible with a lot of stuff. The Terra Onion one specifically will only support specifically like Japanese PC Engine stuff. It's not really compatible with Turbografx or any of the other ones. This has a wider array of compatibility with more hardware, but is more limited in the sense that it doesn't have the ability to give you like RGB out. If Krikzz had some way of getting RGB out of the card itself, which obviously this model couldn't, like if he had made a much thicker one that actually, kind of like that RGB blaster he did for the Famicom, if he did the same type of thing, but for this, man, that would be something. But you know, that's just a fantasy on my end. Anyway, so that'll do it for this. If you guys want to check it out, again, there's a link in the description to retrotowers.co.uk. So thank you again to them. Thank you very much for watching. And if you guys can do me a favor again, please like the video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, as well as, oh, I should have mentioned it does work with the Turbografx. It does. It's actually pretty cool being able to play CD games on that thing. I thought that was neat. But yes, please like, comment, subscribe, social media stuff in the description, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.